Okay, welcome everybody to Reshaping the Sugar. Fabulous exhibition that you can go to White Hot Magazine and read Erin's review. I think one thing about that review, which is beautiful, Erin did a great job, is that she spoke very eloquently about what she saw and what the show is about. Unlike many others who, I don't name any critics who give their own view, right? This is how I think, this is what I see, this is what I know. Erin was fabulous in just laying it out and saying that for whatever reason she feels after this year we spent here in majorly feminist curatorials that we have become kind of spot for BIPOC and such and such. And I think that's nice because this is what we are attempting to. And the main reason, after meeting Johanna, she's not only a curator, she's also a program developer, is that I went through the 23 years prior, and boy, the amount of men we covered, international, I was flabbergasted. Take Alison Knowles, Beth Edelson, I mean, we did a number of exhibitions, but I was just, when am I going to just switch gears? No, because of the Me Too, no, just because, I owe it to my mother, perhaps to my sisters.
Percent of the world population or something.
And that too, in our schools, and artists, there's far more women than artists, so we're going to continue doing that. And I'm not going to dull the afternoon by blabbing away. I'm just the artistic director, and I welcome this eloquent exhibition that will have been given us for a month another view to the Caribbean. Not that offshore banking, not that is for pleasure, but just 7 eloquent women artists from the Caribbean, each one of them giving us their take. So I'm going to pass the mic to the curator.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you the artists, thank you to Juan and White Bus. I would like to say some things about the process of the exhibition, because when Juan invited me to develop this project, White Box already had framed. He said Caribbean women artists, New York based or based in USA. So I'm a feminist art historian and curator. I already had worked, around the colonial ideas, and under that perspective, I had to wonder myself what it doesn't mean to be a Caribbean woman. I was born in Bogota, Colombia. This is a city in the Andes Mountain, a cold city whole year. People is wearing black clothes usually, but I grew up in a hot city named Cali, Colombia. We dance salsa and things like that, but we are closer to the Pacific, not to the Caribbean. And I used to spend half of my life in Mexico City, and I've been in small places there, and even in Guatemala, in a small place named Livingston, Agarifuna community. Then when you say Honduras is in the Caribbean, well, it doesn't mean to be a Caribbean woman living in the United States. Obviously, I have reading, many articles about the Caribbean with the historical issues and etc. And I know the work that, you are a very relevant group of artists, Coco, Jory, all of them, Juana. But probably, I can make a completely different exhibition with your work, Then I was trying to find information about your work, your perspective for long, and I realized that all of you have worked about the idea of historical context, and that makes a difference. And context of the whole exhibition. How is the dialogue with the work of the other artists? You know, I don't know if we can start with Juana. She's in Florida right now.
Is she here?
Yeah.
I'm here. I can hear you. I don't know if you can hear me well, but can we start with somebody else? I think no. I'm interested in being part of this conversation, and I want to hear about the artist's works, and I feel like. So for me, what really interests me about being in, so I want to begin by saying what interests me about being in this exhibition. And so of course the most important part is, yes, Johanna idea I thought was really intriguing, but I was also interested in being in an exhibition with this other group of women artists who I felt were having a similar discourse about the Caribbean from what I see as a more critical and contemporary discourse, right? That it was, a lot of the time, I think, in the past, we see the Caribbean as trying to sort of, I think that maybe I should say in the past, the discourse has been based more on how do we identify the Caribbean, right? Or how do we identify Latin America? And what are the signals? What are the signs? What are the images that are being used to represent this sort of geographical part of the world, which is what that title really does. And so I feel, and what I thought was unifying the work of all the women in the exhibition was that they had a very critical look at this, right, and not not trying to define what it is, but sort of looking at it in a global context. And how that sort of has evolved, not just in the past, but also in the present. And it's this sort of critical conversation that I'm really interested in having, that I feel is very necessary to have right now, as we are here trying to define so many other different terminologies that I will not go into in this conversation. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you. Yes, and I should mention one more thing that is about the women's body and the exoticization of our bodies. And I believe that there is something relevant here in Jodi's work, Jodi, in general. I believe that in the whole works in the exhibition, there is an issue that the artists are pointing out about our body, how the ideas, the memories, the historical issues are under the control of something that was constituted under the colonial ideas, and it is still working, you know, and it's taking over the thing that it is supposed to think about ourselves. I believe that is something relevant in the exhibition. Even through this month, I've been thinking that I should add some lines in the original curatorial text. You know, like Monet, when he was in an exhibition and he went to make some retouches in the paintings at the end. Okay, well, let's go through that way. Maybe Coco Fusco wants to introduce yourself and come introduce, please.
But my piece isn't really about female bodies. It's
Yeah.
more, okay. So I'm Coco, and my video's in the little room over there. And it's called Message in a Bottle from Maria Elena. It's part of a series of videos that I started working on in 2011 that had to do with conflicts between artists and the state in Cuba. And each piece deals with a particular conflict that's representative of the struggles of a decade. So I did a piece about Eberto Padilla that was about the 60s and the early 70s, one about where Reinaldo Arenas hid in Parque Lenin as a fugitive in the 70s. And the piece about Maria Elena is about the 80s. And she is a poet and cultural activist who won the National Poetry Prize in Cuba in 1989, I think, and was a member of a generation that saw the arrival of perestroika in the Soviet Union and was expecting something parallel to happen in Cuba. And she got together with a group of intellectuals at the end of the 80s to try to, well, first they were the first artists who broke with the Artists and Writers Union officially. Because up until that time, to be recognized as an artist in Cuba, you had to be a member of a union. Otherwise, you didn't have the professional title of it, and you would be a vagrant, and then you could be put in prison. So they made a public statement about withdrawing to make their own organization that was called Criterio Alternativo, right, alternative criteria. And one of the projects that they had was to try to change the Cuban Constitution legally, right, to be able to have broader civil rights, more protections, more expressive freedoms. And they did this right at the moment of, so the Berlin Wall comes down in 89 and the Soviet Union dissolves in 91. And in those 2 years, there was a tremendous tumult in the former socialist bloc. And in Cuba, what happened basically was that the economy went into a total meltdown because they lost all their subsidy from the Soviet Union. So something like 75% of the money that was coming in disappeared within 2 years. And the economy collapsed, people were starving, there were riots over food all over the place, and waves of repression, because when you have economic instability, it generates in Cuba of a much more vicious response from the power structure. So she spearheaded this effort to change the Constitution. She was targeted for doing this, and subject to unbelievable kinds of harassment and threats. And at a certain point, she was basically trapped inside her apartment in Alamar, which is in the eastern part of Havana, with her children. And they cut off her gas and her water. And they had these mobs outside. And, chanting anti-communist, calling her a traitor and everything. So at one point, the mob breaks into her apartment, drags her out, and then, because she's a poet, started taking pages out of a book of her poetry and making her eat her words in front of the mob. And then she was arrested and spent 2 years in prison, and when she got out, she went to the U.S. to retrieve an award that she had been given, and she was, and Cuba cut off her Cuban passport so that she became stateless and was never allowed to go back. So, this is a legendary story because it was televised. Very few acts of repression in Cuba are, but there were television cameras there. And I went to the area, many years later, and it turned out that people I knew there knew the person who had led the mob. And that person was still alive and living in Alamar. So I wanted to figure out a way, and I found Maria Elena working as a security guard in Florida. Like nobody, remember, she's not like a public figure anymore, even though in the early 90s she was all over the press in Miami and in Spain, and it was the big story. So I wanted to get, compare and contrast these memories of this time. And, I went back, I found an apartment, because I found people who had been children at the time, and in the schools they had acts of repudiation against the sons and daughters of this woman. So the people who were now grown up remember attacking the kids, right? So I built the story out of this, and yeah, so that's the whole attempt was to go into a history that is repressed in Cuba, that was there, but I just through relations found a lot of the survivors of the event, and also found other artists who tried to go to film and were arrested at the time, and then imprisoned, but now are living in Mexico or here or there to be able to weave this story together.
Thank you. me, the dialogue between your work and Jody's, and in general, but with Jacqueline and Jody's work is relevant. I was trying to find an artist living in Florida, for example. Because, yeah, I know, but living in Florida, I consider it as because Juana is living close. You know, she's now in Florida.
Massachusetts.
In Massachusetts, she's living in Massachusetts. But to talk about some North American uses in the Caribbean, you know, North American issues in the Caribbean. What about that? That wasn't easy. That was impossible. You know, I found anybody to talking about that. But I'm trying to say that Jody is recovering some memories and history and an archive from Jamaica. But she brings that story and she located that memories in United States. And I believe that this is a relevant exercise. And I love the dialogue between the history, the personal story of Jacqueline, your work, and what is happening with the transnational archive issues in the Jody's work. I believe that there is a relevant dialogue because the exhibition in general is trying to bring up the traditional idea that the Caribbean is one place. It's not one place. That's completely impossible. Different countries, races, culture, language, trajectories, and on that way, that was a challenge to put different issues because your work you can find the connection and there is a change of ideas, especially in the way that you can going through the exhibition. But that was a conceptual, complicated process, and I believe that we made a good job. But I just want to point it out that because you say something that my work is different, but you know it's fitted in the exhibition on that way.
It's just that Cuba is never treated as part of anything. It's always dealt with as, you know, some kind of juggernaut exception to every rule. It's like, and there are many Cuban historians and political scientists that point out how wrong that is. That actually, you know, there's ways to understand Cuba. There's a lot of connections and geographies and political histories that are very similar. And also there are, you know, contemporary political alliances that, it's like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua is one very strong. And then the pink tide, then you have to include Brazil and Bolivia with that, and now Chile. That, you know, there are relations and also travel. And then within Cuba, there are a lot of Jamaicans in Cuba. There are a lot of Haitians in Cuba. There, you know, especially in the southeast part of the island, because these were people that came to cut sugarcane and would stay, right? But now a lot of Cubans are using their grandparents' nationalities in the other islands to get out of Cuba, to be able to get passports in other places. So, and then there's also a lot of, going further back in time, connections with New Orleans and Haiti, because after the Haitian Revolution, a lot of the slave-holding families moved to Cuba or went on to New Orleans. So Cuban migration follows those patterns, right? So there's Cuban colonies in each of these places, and now even more, because we just had the biggest exodus in history of 300,000 people leaving in a year,
right.
And they're scattered everywhere.
And one thing we did, a chance, I made it possible to open it during Black History Month. Because here we talk about Black History Month as if it was Martin Luther King and, you know, everything in the continent. It really came through the Caribbean.
Well, you know,
Cuba,
don't
Haiti,
get me started. There are more
No.
black people in Latin America. There are more black people in Latin America than in the United States, but nobody ever recognizes that here. That actually, that we are more African than American, than African Americans.
That's the issue. Cali,
Don't get me
probably
started.
the 51% of the population in Cali is black, and the 48% is a mix, you know, between black and native people. But we are maybe 3 days far from the Atlantic Ocean. This is a Caribbean city or no? that's the issue. That's one of the issues of this exhibition. Okay, Jacqueline, please.
I just, learned a lot from your documentary because I was growing up in the 80s and I didn't know about this
Nope.
part of history at
It's
all.
repressed.
No?
It's suppressed.
Yes. So just bringing back the 1989, that I was even thinking about that, but it's the year that I graduated from the photography school. And all the photographic material was coming from Orwell. And, the Orwell stopped sending anything because both Germans went together.
Right.
So I decided to say, well, it's very expensive to be a photographer. I will become a writer then, and I will take notes, and that's how I start writing. So now I consider myself a writer, but I am always looking different platforms to render whatever idea I have. So it comes with, in the form of a video, or it could be an installation or a paste up or different formats, for the writing, but mainly a writer who also consider literature not a form that is purely verbal. So that allows me to move between different media. And for this exhibition, I'm super excited that you invited me, thinking mainly that I will have this, I will have different perspective of what is the Caribbean, extending the Caribbean to New York, which is something that we have been doing for many years in something that we have been doing for many years in academia. We're here in New York, part of the Caribbean, and that's going back and forth from Havana in our case and New York, and still being affected by post country policies, creating this subject that is always a subject of a nation. It doesn't matter where you go. It doesn't matter if you change passport. You're always retained. And then I am also interested in locating myself in very uncomfortable locations where, in this case, for my work, I am totally aware of this contradiction, that I am participating in a process that I oppose to, and that from that very uncomfortable location, I always want to do my work. So in this case, it's just, my work is auto-fictional, so I will take always a personal event and kind of fictionalize in order to connect with a larger audience or communities. And in this case, I did the repatriation process. I, submitted, and I did everything through the same channels that didn't allow me to go back to my country in 1999. So the question is this a new category now where I'm going to fit as a repatriated, and what that means for the voice of the poet. So more than thinking about the body that is absent and it's just left there in a poem that is, marking these places where I live or ate in the 80s and late 90s when I was houseless there, trying to kind of claiming those spaces and understanding that the voice of the poet that is repatriated, it doesn't have really any place to circulate, that it would need to do it in ruins or, I don't know, or being part of the system that is actually rejecting. So for me, it was very important that you invite me and then that you recognize that uncomfortable location that I find. You say, Jacqueline, I would like to have your work because I know that you are always thinking about conflict zones, even when it looks just very personal, which is something I'm interested to in trying to find in that lesbian continues, because lesbian are also totally out of any history, the Cuban history, Caribbean history. So in ways of always finding that mirror and locating that voice that doesn't really have a place, and finding it in these drawings. So what's important for me to be in this dialogue about the Caribbean and what it means, particularly because we are always categorized in these different notions or concepts that are more than anything imposed on us, and sometimes we don't have a choice to say, okay, I'm this and that. And now this new category for someone who have been circulating in an alternative way, for not saying marginal way, because I was never part of the system, I was never part of the CDRs, I was never part of Pioneros Comunistas, so it was very difficult for me to integrate, no? And being from the outside, at least I can bring that perspective in to, this is also Cuba, no? People who are not, Coco was mentioning before, the artists that are institutionalized, are very institutionalized, so for that, it's difficult to produce work if you don't belong. I'm from there, from that location, I've been always, coming back, wherever I go, coming back from Cuba, to Cuba, obsessively, trying to recreate and trying to say, okay, there's this narrative that is lost and we need to find a continuum, and, there must be a mirror somewhere, to reflect.
Maybe you made me think about a relevant issue, at least in my life, and I believe that it's in this exhibition too. When I was living in Mexico City, I love Mexico City. It's a relevant part of my heart and my stomach. But I was always a foreigner there. I was Johanna, my Colombian friend. And I was, I lived there for 14 or 15 years, maybe a half of my life. And when I come to New York, at the beginning, the sensation to be in the middle of a cosmopolitan place was great, but in a certain point, me and everybody, everybody, we have to identify ourselves like someone, People always ask me, where are you from? You need to define yourself, and there's some, what can I say? Well, I was born in Colombia, but I grew up there. I can tell you that then I don't defend the idea of the homeland. I don't know, I can do that because something is broke inside of me about that idea. But this is something very strong. It's not the same thing to be from Latin America than to be a Latinx in New York. It's a completely different thing. And it's a trend that you have to take in account when you are living in New York, that you are from Latin America. And now, plus, you are from the Caribbean, where, a Caribbean or a Caribbeans, there are different places. Maybe in a certain point, I'm starting to think that the idea of identity maybe is something, I don't know, it's risky to say that it's a cliché maybe. I'm not sure, but I'm from Colombia. I love to dance salsa. So
there's some performativity that is always expected when you identify with something. After that, you have to perform that identity. And then it's, how Cuban you are or how New Yorker you are. It's like, it's expecting always that you have to perform.
And it's political. It's something political.
It's always political.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Jackie.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this exhibition. Start there. Honored to be here with you all. I guess I could start by saying, the Caribbean is not a monolith. I guess I segue into this by saying the work that I'm presenting here is very much, of course, including the body, the female body, and I chose to make this work since 2018 called Junk Canoe Comes, this ongoing series of work that is basically taking the idea from the junk canoe, the Jamaican version of the junk canoe, which is a masquerade that was performed in the Victorian times, 19th century, early 19th century in Jamaica. And after I came across this concept because of another collaborative idea I was a part of working with someone else, but I decided to kind of just get more into what is this about instead of just like a one-off performance where I'm wearing this colonial type of costume, but it's kind of a riff off of the Victorian, the 1837 version that was a lithograph documenting the early Jamaican junk canoe. As you see in the drawing here on the right, that's illustrating that. And so it's funny because I came across this work too, being amused by it because growing up in Jamaica and being raised there and then migrating here as pretty much a 12-year-old and going to, when growing up in Jamaica, it's thought of anything that was too African as bad. I was not allowed to even speak my dialect, which is Jamaican patois. And so Junkanoo, like that's nothing, I didn't know about it growing up, which is kind of the effects of colonialism, just like, you're not allowed to speak this way, you're supposed to act very like dignified, British, whatever, European, the more proper English you speak, the better. And so there's this class thing that covers. But I don't know, I guess I want to say that, yeah, I was amused by it, and it's kind of a way for me to learn more about this part of my heritage that was frowned upon while growing up there in the Caribbean. And so being now a Jamaican American, I'm finding like there are some parallels between the early form of Junkanoo that was even frowned upon in Jamaica post the emancipation of slavery in 1838 there. So, and then there's this resurgence in the early 1950s when they wanted to kind of bring it back. It was celebrated only between Christmas and New Year's, the holidays, the only times that the enslaved had off. And so I'm making this parallel between this house of power before it was a houseboat or like the plantation house on the head that the head masquerader is wearing. And so I was like, okay, well here I am still under this oppression, there's this house of power over my head. And so I wanted to really delve into that more and kind of bring it into a contemporary context. So along with that, there are other characters, and this particular masquerade women were not even allowed to perform. And so it's kind of a way of reclaiming that space as well. So, I don't know. Yeah, there's some characters, there are different troops on the island I've found, and I'm still very much working on this series. I don't know when it's going to be done, but I'm reading there are like 10 to 20 performers on average in the different troops around the island in Jamaica. They're just starting to embrace this and revive this masquerade even more. And so, and it's the most Afrocentric one in the Caribbean because even Belize has it, and Haiti has their own version of this kind of masquerade festival that's confronting the oppressor. So, yeah.
Maybe I have a common question because there is a concept in social science, it's translation. It's not specifically related with language, but I believe that in your work that's relevant because you are bringing something, you are keeping some roots, but at the same time, when you are locating your work here in the United States, there is a translation, not in language, it's a cultural translation. So I would like to know more how you reconnect, those roots because it's personal. But finally, in the performance, especially in the public space, you are reconnected with the people, the roots. What is happening there, in that scenario, public spaces?
I don't know. I'm thinking this work is a way to educate the public about these folkloric traditions. There's some components, of course, that's European. It's like this. It's very much too like you're talking about transculturation. There's some of that going on in here too because there's some costumes that are more vegetal and more, even though it's what's the word? It's secular. I was thinking about that. It's I don't know. Yeah, there are archetypes. Thinking about like different cultural archetypes. Like some are more feminine, some are very much about like fertility and that kind. There's this nature component to some of these works. So I'm thinking like that is kind of a way to give the public some kind of entrance point to it. That's maybe not what the question is, but power too. Like I'm kind of also bringing in like the police, for instance. There's this troops have exactly the same, but generally there are like maybe 5 to 10 that are more prominent characters. And so there are some differentiations based on like the local troops that are on the island. So I wanted to kind of like bring back, for instance, this police character, which is very much one that we can relate to here, and thinking about what does that look like? How would I execute this or make it more understandable in today's society? You know, we're under like thinking about Black Lives Matter and thinking about like the forms of oppression by police and police killing people of color, and police is not one color either. So in my example, I illustrated this as a character wearing police mask, but like different. That brings that idea that that archetype into contemporary version of contemporary context. So yeah.
Thank you, Cody. Joy.
Sounds almost
Yeah, we get it. So, yeah, well, I'm really happy and excited to be part of this dialogue, and I was really excited when you approached me with the curatorial kind of, contextualization of the work and of the exhibition, and yeah, being in dialogue with these other women artists from the Caribbean with different approaches to that and coming from different places, and even like how we were talking about a place cannot be I don't know, diminished to even a place because there's multiple places coming through a place. Thinking about like how you have like Chinese descent and you're Jamaican, or what I was saying earlier about the Jamaicans and Haitians in Cuba who also have Chinese, and how we're all here in New York. So, yeah, the works that I have in the show are 2 videos, one of which is called Siboney, it's from 2014 and might relate more to the conversation we were having a little minute ago about this experience of being reduced to your identity when you come to another place. That's a lot of the context where that piece comes from. So I came to New York to study art in 2011, and I grew up in the Dominican Republic. I was born in New York, but I grew up in the Dominican Republic. And coming here was this experience of, similar to you, being asked a lot where I was from, and discovering the associated performativity related to that identity here. Even though there's tons of Dominicans in New York, you still get a lot of this flattening of identity. So having grown up in the Dominican Republic is not something that I had to deal with. There's other things that we deal with in the DR. Identity related, race, class, and all these things. But here it's like all of that just gets flattened to whatever facade you are understood through. So Siboney is a video where I spent like 4 weeks painting a repeating pattern of tropical plants that I found in a piece of fabric actually at Parsons. There was this room where students would drop off materials that they didn't want to use for someone else to then reuse them. So I did a lot of work from that room, and I found that piece of fabric after my kind of thesis was a little wrapped up. So I ended up kind of unpacking what that pattern meant for me after graduating. But what I ended up doing with it was copying the pattern onto a wall in a museum for this biennial, and thinking of my labor of copying this like superficial thing through which the Caribbean, and then I also understood many other tropical spaces in the world, are represented through for the global north. thinking of my labor, repeating this in relation to the maintenance of this facade and in relation to the maintenance of tourism, which is a system through which we are understood a lot through this in the Caribbean. And then the second part of the piece is that once I'm done doing that, I pour water on my body and I undo the painting because it's gouache, so it's reversible. And then with my body transform the painting, and I see that in the video as a moment where I'm reclaiming this agency as a maker and a creator, and like I'm no longer repeating this thing that was, I guess, symbolically imposed onto me in terms of identity. And then I'm also showing another piece called Labadi, which is a video that documents a cruise trip that was stopping in different places, but it's called Labadi because I mostly just focus in Labadi. It's a city in Haiti where this cruise stopped, and Labadi IE is the name of the town. Labadi EE is a trademark from Royal Caribbean. That is the fenced off space port that they bring you to. And in other stops of the cruise, you get to take a taxi and go around and maybe go to a museum or something for 3 hours and then you come back to the cruise. But in Labadi EE, you are offered only what is on this side of the fence. And there's a lot of, I don't know, zip line and I don't know what else, because I was just recording, I wasn't taking part of any of that. But all of this consumption goes back to the Royal Caribbean, and even the people who are Haitians who then are selling you souvenirs or selling you music, like CDs and other things. When I talked to them, they told me that they had to pay Royal Caribbean a fee to be able to perform in that space. So that video kind of illustrates a lot of the problematic dynamics that play out in the Caribbean, especially in these touristic spaces. But also the video is linking to this historical narrative, because when there's shots of the open sea, like the wake that the boat leaves on the water, at the beginning of the video, that have text from Christopher Columbus's diary when they were first seeing signs of land in the Americas when they arrived, and seeing like little green foliage floating, and that's a sign of land, and we're getting there. And then it switches from that narrative to kind of describing what you're seeing in Labadi, the contemporary location. And there's no dialogue. It's all of these narrative things that I'm describing are just subtitles guiding that narrative aspect. And yeah, I see it a lot in conversation with both of these works, with everything that's going on. I think especially it was really nice to see the dialogue of that video with Juana's piece, which also recontextualizes this historic text and images of galleons, and seeing that conversation there, but also everything else. It's
I believe that the whole works that are here in the exhibition are working with documents or archives. But I would like you, to go deep in something specific in Siboney, because there is something powerful there, is that you are using your body as a document to climb bodies and memories, and you are embodying this story. And there is a very relevant relationship between the mural, the women in the mural, and your body, and the action that you are performing there. I would like you to talk about this idea, because there are a performativity in the whole exhibition with the archive. Relunca's work, she's bringing, using it, documents, photo archive of women from India, in Barbados. But in this specific performance, your body is a document, is working with an archive, reproducing, in a life things, historical problems.
Right. Yeah, there's, I was thinking a lot of, so, I'm trying to think of where to start, but there's a lot of directions that join together in that piece. One of which is I was in a residency right after graduating that had a green screen room, and I had several men like by themselves on the green screen room and recorded them dancing to the beat of the song Simone, which was a song that was composed by Ernesto Lecuona, who's a Cuban composer, in 1929, I think. And then reperformed in the late 50s by Connie Francis. So the version that I'm using is Connie Francis's version. And I first heard it in a Victoria's Secret ad for bikinis. And I heard it again in Wong Kar-wai's 2046 movie. And in both of these spaces, you have this kind of exoticized woman performing this kind of seductress type of archetype. And I was interested in the performativity that is attached to the song by itself, because it's Connie Francis's version has like more drums and it sounds very seducting, versus some of the original versions that I heard, which were more kind of emphasizing piano. And I read, I'm not sure if it's true, that Lecuona composed that song when he was away from Cuba, and it's linked to nostalgia, but then seeing the transformation of the song in the global imaginarium as becoming this, other thing, I thought spoke to the things that I was interested in, and also spoke to the things that I was interested in, the pattern and the repetition of the pattern, and all of these associations that we have to these visuals of tropical patterns. Another funny thing about that pattern is that what looks like flowers is not flowers, it's a philodendron leaf that is colored red, so it acts as flowers in our imaginarium. So like all of this like ridiculous transformations were things that I was interested in, and I think that going back to that exercise of recording men in the green screen room, that's something that I then kind of watched. It was funny to see them move to the beat of this song and kind of this performativity coming through. So I think that also informed what ended up being the piece at the end, where the moment where I'm like transforming the painting with my body, I'm also moving to the beat of the song and thinking of all of this converging performativities, or trying to channel some of that. And something that I thought a lot in that piece and in subsequent works was trying to find agency in those embodiments and trying to subvert those stereotypes at the same time as I am embodying them. And I think that started a little earlier than that piece, but maybe like solidified in a more legible way in that piece. I don't know that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great. Thank you so much. Maybe someone want to ask to the artist about the exhibition or pieces. Juan, I want to say something. Juan.
Yes, I mean, it's been wonderful. I have to say, I have to force to hear everybody's conversation, which is really wonderful, and description of their work too. I listening to what everybody has spoken about the work, and beginning with Coco. I'm caught by two things. This idea of the difference between recreation and reenactment, right? That there's a difference between reenactment and recreation, and that somehow within all of the works that have been presented, there is a component of sort of recreating an object, or recreating an experience, recreating a memory, recreating in action and sort of recontextualizing that information, right? And sort of adding to or bringing in larger other contexts that really sort of speak to the moment and moving through different environments in terms of what happened in the past and where it is in the present. And I think that this is something that sort of takes place within everybody's works in a different way. But it's another connecting theme of the exhibition itself. And I don't know if anybody wants to sort of talk about this aspect. And I'm actually really curious, especially with Coco, how does she feel about sort of as the relationship between a reenactment and a recreation and this slash documentary slash archive, and so where does this work sit, right, in creating a space to talk about these past in a contemporary moment. I just wanted to say to Jory's piece, which also is wonderful to see again, is that I actually really what I take away is this moment in which she is actually creating this erasure of this superficial, repetition, and sort of with that physically with her body, and at the same time, she's actually staining the fabric, right, and creating a new pattern that perhaps might be more real than what is offered in the original image that she painted in terms of how messy and undefined the Caribbean can be. But I'm curious if anybody
you want me to answer that
thinking about this idea of reenactment.
Did you want me to answer that question? Okay, so I've done both recreation and reenactment in work. I think that in a mainstream context, there's still this idea that documentaries only represent pre-filmic realities. In other words, that the camera comes because something's already happening, right? But if you study film, you know that from the very beginning with people like Robert Flaherty, that it was all a setup, even when he would go out to film Inuits in Alaska and anywhere else, it was all like, you guys stand there, dress up like this and do this, right? So there really isn't a moment in documentary where reenactment and recreation is not already happening. But sometimes it's more obvious, and I think that in the history of American documentaries, that when you get people like Michael Moore coming in and Errol Morris, who was the first famous documentarian to actually do recreations and tell you this is a recreation, right? That it becomes more part of the standard language. I think in the issues that I'm dealing with that have to do with aspects of Cuban history that the official state narrative leaves out or represses or censors, the problem is a political one. It's not just an aesthetic one. It's what do you do when you can't access the archive? What do you do when the state owns a certain version of history and imposes a certain history, but you know it's not, that's not the whole story or even the story, right? And how do you manage that? And so for me, it has been, work with existing fragments, right? And then build around fragments. And in the case of the story of Maria Elena Cruz Varela, she's still alive, so I had her, right? And then I found like the counterpart, right? I had the victim and the victimizer, and I've gone on all sorts of crazy antiquarian bookseller sites and found old editions of books and gone into collections. Like Princeton has a great Latin American collection of documents. They took everything from America Society years ago, so they have all this correspondence. And in France, there's the National Archive, Audiovisual Archive, has a lot of Cuban material. So over the years, I've learned how to find fragments, right, and to build around fragments. The real problem with filmmaking and recreation and reenactment is money, because the more you dramatize, the more expensive it becomes. Right? So, film which a lot of intellectuals love, and film festivals have liked. People like Chris Marker's famous for this, but there's lots of other people. Film essays are cheap to do. Recreations and reenactments are very expensive, and I just finished like a feature-length piece where I have recreations, dramatic recreations, and I spent 10 times more than I'd ever spent before on a piece just to be able to have actors and a crew and a set and this and that. It just costs a lot more money, and it takes a lot more work to make it believable. Because that verisimilitude thing of Hollywood film is very, very, very expensive to do. That's why stupid films with bad scripts and mediocre actors still cost $5 million, because it's all about that dramatic part.
Yeah, Gabriel Garcia Marquez used to say that he became a writer because to be a filmmaker was too expensive. But I would like to make a comment about that, because the best definition for a document that I have found is a remnant or a scrap. And for archive is a structure to organize, those pieces of scraps. Then there is something relevant in this exhibition related with the archive, is that we can change the past. The past is something that we can change all the time. The relevant thing is that we need to recognize that you can do it, and that the others made it before. They wrote the history, the ideas, they put the bodies, the power, the gender, the social class in the order that they consider, that was the proper way to do it. But that's something that we can do now, and this exhibition is recreating, overwriting the history or overriding the past. And that's something that we can change constantly. And I believe that was an exercise that we did well in this exhibition. The dialogue in your work are changing the way we are thinking the Caribbean history, the Caribbean memory, the Caribbean bodies. There are something powerful that is happening there, especially here in New York. I don't know if I can identify myself as a Caribbean woman, a Latinx Caribbean woman. That maybe is too complicated. It's a frame and I have to fit there. I'm not sure if my native Caribbean black white body can fit in one of those ideas.
Is it complicated, or is it just? I don't even know what Latinx is, frankly. I don't use it. All these things are to a certain degree fictions, right? I feel sorry for my very young students who actually believe that they're real, and I have to kind of break it down. But I don't see the point of just because whatever system needs to do categorize people, it doesn't necessarily mean that one has to accept that as that I don't have to do it. When people ask me, are you Latinx? I say no. The end of story.
Yeah,
it's over.
Exactly. How can I be?
Well, but it's a fiction.
Yeah,
it's just a fiction.
It's an academic construction too.
Yes, it's an academic construction, but it's a fiction that is. Okay, why do institutions want this now? I was just doing some entries to film festivals, and they want to know because they've been attacked for being all white, and so now they want the statistics to be able to say, well, no, we actually are not, because we have X, Y, and Z, and they need categories. But in my own lifetime, when I was very young, people who were of Latin American descent in New York were Spanish. They were called Spanish, but in a very derogatory way, or spick, right? Because the emphasis was on language, right? And then it became Hispanic, and then it was, and that was the Nixon administration. And then, so as not to overemphasize the Spanish component, it became Latino, right? And then there's Chicanos who are of a certain generation of Mexican migration from the West Coast. And then there's the political term of Puerto Rican, which is much more specific. And it just goes on and on. Every 3 or 4 years, it becomes something else that you have to say.
But
for a census, census purposes.
There is something there, because what is needed to put all these people in that box? Because they don't say that they need a concept like a Europex.
Well, you do have to. if you are filling out certain kinds of government documents or applications for schooling, grants, you do have to, if you're white,
Yeah.
and then it gets very complicated because it's like non-Hispanic white, right? Non this one, because there's, there are white Latin Americans, right? Even though some people would not like that to recognize that, but there are lots of people of Europe that are, whose parents were from Spain and who were born in, Colombia or Dominican Republic or Cuba or whatever, and they are just white, right?
Then there
So-
is a relevant issue about the present in relationship with the past. I'm trying to say that this is a fish point to change things. To go deep in the categories. And we are working.
It's also to understand that it's a game, it's a political game.
Absolutely.
But also that there are reasons why at certain times it's important to, this is a moment in which there's a market for difference. I'm old enough, I'm in my 60s, to have seen this come and go 2 or 3 times in my life, right? This is not, in the 90s it was not cool. And now it's cool again to kind of market difference, so there are collectors buying art because of the perceived difference. There are foundations giving money for exhibitions because of perceived difference, right? There's a market incentive to accentuate difference, and this is also why in Black American art there's such an emphasis on figuration, because it allows you to identify the Black person in the picture, right? So it's all a market thing, which some young people respond to as if this were a real reason to partake, because that's the reality that they know. But I'm actually doing some research now, working on a project that's not artistic, it's more academic, about why Felix Gonzalez Torres is never recognized as a Cuban artist by white establishment, because it would damage the price point of his art sales. But it's also because none of those art historians, critics, curators have ever gone to Cuba to actually meet the relatives that are still there, the friends that are still there. They don't know anything about all the Cubans in Miami and his Cuban boyfriend who he had after the white guy who they always talk about, right? That there's a whole history of Felix as a Cuban that has been completely erased because it's not beneficial to the market or the experts that are in charge of selling his work at David's Werner. Okay, so but you have to know where Guaymaro is, which is where he's from. You have to know how to get in touch with people there. You have to know how to communicate with them. You have to know who the Cuban art historians who have done work on him are. You have to know the Cuban art collectors who supported him before white Americans did. You have to know all the curators in Miami and in Puerto Rico that worked with him continuously, secretly, because the white Americans never paid attention to that. And you also have to know that the foundation that's now in Colorado refuses to recognize all of that work.
Yeah,
Okay?
absolutely.
So, but
Just wait. Just a quick thing. I think also. No, because it is a really. She's very on point. That's what I love about Coco. She's always on point. And I think it's really important to also understand, because I was part of another symposium where this question was also posed in a different context. The fact that they do take his homosexuality, right?
Right.
David is okay because we know how to market that, right? And we know how to sell that, and that isn't okay. But yeah, you never hear about his Cubanness. And to me, it's like, well, how do you separate? How do you extract one from the other, right? And when we think about those go-go boy sculpture or performance piece, do you really think that those go-go boys were like white people doing go? No, they were not. They were brown boys, with gold lame, on bars. And it is a really important point to discuss, because it's also about, back to the original conversation, it is about markets. When it's about sort of what is being dictated in terms of how we can quantify and qualify certain information at this point in time.
Yeah, I would like to say something. We don't have much
No.
time yet, but thank you so much. That's great. But I would like to say that white is a color. And white color has its own troubles, its own historical issues. but it seems that only the other colors, are colored colors, and only those colors, have problems, about race, social class, gender, and etc. The problems of the white color, because white is a color, it's not a neutral place, it seems that it doesn't appear. And I believe that we need to point it out. We need to start to point it out that there is a problem. Because then if I'm white, then my duty is to paint beautiful, and big paintings. Because I'm free to do it. I don't have social issues. I don't know if that's true.
Well, but also there's actually a lot of white abject art that's very famous, whether it's Larry Clark or Paul McCarthy or Mike Kelly, or there are schools of art making that are about kind of abjection and whiteness, and also Nan Golden, now who's getting all this attention because of the film, was very, very good at representing that the kind of abject dimensions of that milieu. And there are artists who have focused on kind of the white working class, the history of the white working class. Alan Sekula, for example.
Yeah, but this is about white working class. But I believe that
I think the problem isn't that we don't pay attention to whiteness. There's a whole school of academics that do that. I think the problem is that we take Latinx seriously. That's the problem, is believing in the categories that have been imposed within the United States on others to define them, instead of saying, this is bullshit, and we can define ourselves however we want. And to just sort of separate, to denaturalize or defamiliarize the categories, instead of saying, why do I have to be this? No, you don't have to be it. And you know what? It's wrong, and this is why. And I'm going to pursue what I'm interested in from wherever I am, however I want to define myself, and the end, it's in defying those categories rather than believing in them.
There is more about the individual issues, because there's a community, and outside of the United States, probably people don't know much about the Latinx context. I believe that this.
Are you kidding? The Tate has already named somebody to look for. They're already using it in Europe. This is
probably in Europe, but I'm talking about Latin America.
But there's a whole thing in Mexico of like talking about white Mexicans.
Yeah, and brown Mexicans and black Mexicans, because they didn't know until recent time, they didn't know that they have a black heritage.
But it's also about adopting American terminology to talk about their reality.
But
that's very dangerous.
At the same time, in Latin America, during the last, probably, especially during the last 20 years, we have been doing a different job to recognize ourselves in our own way and try to be connected, between each other without the need to do it through United States or Europe. And there are many things happening in the global South. They are more connected now. It seems that we are not being a part of that dialogue, because we are here in a different community, and it has to be like that. It's completely different. Then I believe that many things, I'm not trying to define something specific or to get a conclusion today. For me, the relevant thing is to put on the table a big discussion that is there. It's a social discussion. And art is a weapon to put it that. That's what I'm trying to say.
Just a quick note in terms of what Coco just said, because there's a lot of reason and context of what she said, and it's I think it's also hard, especially teaching younger artists, right? For us to say, I think I don't even want to use the right word because it's a Spanish word and it takes a lot. Se necesita mucho cojones para poder decir algo delante. Yeah, that's what you want. Okay. So you have to be who you are, and you have to have a pride at a place, and I think that's why it's also hard for these younger artists to be able to whatever. But you have to have arrived at a certain place to be able to say, no, I'm going to define myself, and I'm going to be able, and I'm going to exist on my terms, and this is the way it is, to this dominant force that controls almost all your accessibility to visibility, to money, to funding, to all of that. And I think that is why there is a certain collapse into whatever terminology, and not that one is better than the other, but whatever that new terminology that sort of is, they prescribe and able to be able to understand and to discuss and to talk about art. And so in that way, I guess maybe I'm a little bit more forgiving and a little bit more willing to bypass terminology, because I do know that these are very transient things that will be changed as they should be, right? I think we cannot continue to define ourselves the way that we would have been doing, from the 13th century. That doesn't make sense to us in this contemporary moment. So that will also change. But there is also another part to the question that is enable for us to define ourselves. We have to begin to agree, and this to go back to the Caribbean and into Latin America, quote unquote. We have an issue. I got another survey that I have to answer. And so, why does Latin American and the Caribbean suffer so much from dictatorships and so forth? And I think a lot has to do in our inability to come to the point to understand that we have been colonized, and that was an issue. And yes, that we may have white people, but we also have other people as well, right? And how do we negotiate our own understanding of who we are and move forward without having to look to North America as a way, as an arbitrator, or as a way to sort of resolve our issues or define who we are? And for me, that's the bigger question. Why doesn't the Caribbean and Latin America sort of define themselves? Why are they not there doing this in a way that is sort of aggressively there? And that doesn't mean that they're not particular individuals making a mark and doing things, but this, I think, is part of a bigger conversation.
It's very difficult to define oneself and to find this kind of identity from who you are if you have on top of you the potency of the United States that invade constantly. Even in the 20th century we have invasion in Dominican Republic. So it's very difficult to avoid the fact that America is, always part of the systems we have, of the corruption or the dictators. It's difficult to do it without connecting to the history of the United States. So I guess that is one of the reasons why.
I think maybe Trinidad and Tobago, because of the oil supply, may be the only Caribbean islands that are economically autonomous enough to not have to bow to U.S. domination. Because if you don't have economic independence and stability, you're not going to have political independence and stability. And all the other Caribbean nations are in some way economically dependent on some other market, because the population doesn't have enough wealth to actually pump the economy, because the labor force isn't, because there isn't an industry other than tourism in most of the other islands that sustains the rest of the economy. So what does that mean? Then if that's all you have, then you're dependent on foreigners. Why has Cuba collapsed economically now? It's because they lost tourism during COVID. And so the economy is shrunk by like 85% in a year. So, and that's the state of, where would Dominican Republic be without tourism? Where would Puerto Rico be without tourism? Where would Jamaica be without tourism? Or the Bahamas, or Bermuda, or Antigua? None of these islands
Greece.
Greece. Well, but we're talking about the Caribbean. You don't have economic independence. You don't have economic autonomy. You will not have political stability. You don't have economic autonomy. You won't have economic stability either. Right? So that explains it to me. And then none of these governments can survive unless they have the backing of some external power, right? And whether that's, Cuba's sort of trying, they're running around, the Escanes running around trying to get China to do it, and Russia to do it, and this one to do it, and that one to do it. But ultimately, that's it. That's really the problem. And is there, maybe Brazil is a little bit more economically self-sustaining, but I don't know. I don't know if Chile's copper is enough to keep it going. But this is really the problem: is which of these countries in Latin America economically is self-sustaining. I don't think that any of them are completely.
Thinking about the terminologies, the terminologies allow you to enter the conversation. If you, for example, when you go to conference, if you don't use the right language, you just have the conversation. Nobody wants to talk to you if you don't use that terminology. So it's part of the pressure also. I mean, when you go to a conference that includes modern languages, you see that the publications, all of them are coming in English. So it's absolutely a pressure, another pressure that you have to continue using the language that is most of the time imposed by American academia.
Well, that's something that I was trying to say a while ago. It's in English here in the United States, always, but currently there are a huge academic production in Latin America, and relevant and powerful, and that changes things there, there, people there, and maybe it's not relevant here, but the issue is that the things that are happening here maybe are not so relevant today as those things used to be 20 years ago, and that's a change. That's something different.
I'm not so sure about that. Because the thing is that that the United States still has the majority of Latin Americanists are here. Because of the size of the country, the size of the economy, the number of universities, the amount of funding available. I mean, LASA, the Latin American Studies Association includes scholars from Latin America, but they're in the minority in relationship to how many Latin Americans are in the United States. Working at American institutions. I still think, even though that's the case, I still think that it is possible to enter these dialogues in order to critique them. In other words, that one doesn't have to be completely subservient to the discourse. You can enter in order to challenge the terms of the conversation. But you have to know what those terms are and be able to be conversant in them, and then try to flip them around or throw them in, or question them.
I'm agree with you and with you in general in terms of the institution and the economic, because there is a relevant issue now. But I believe that especially in South America, artists and academic people, I cannot say that they're jumping that things, but they are addressing in a completely different way that. And that's making a difference. Maybe this is still being a tender time to see it, but it's there. I just give you that feel. Maybe let's see in 5 or 10 years. But things are happening very powerful, especially in Argentina, in Chile, and in Bolivia. They are working in a different way. Even with their own governments on law, they're, I don't know, something happened, something relevant is happening there. But
in terms of visual art, the wealth in the Latin American millionaires keep their money outside of their countries.
Mm-hmm.
They bank in Europe and they bank here. And the tendency has been since the 90s, which is really when the market began to develop for contemporary Latin American art. The tendency was for the major collectors to come to the United States to buy. Even if they were buying Latin American art, they prefer to go to Miami and New York to a fair, to buy it there. They'll pay more to fly to New York to buy the work there, because the fact that it's there means that it's better than if they bought it in Caracas or bought it in Rio de Janeiro.
I agree, but again, we are talking again about the money. And maybe that's the issue. That in that moment, for example, if you read about how the feminists in Argentina are talking about the debt, means the word the debt is completely different. Then on that way, the same way that I'm thinking art. For them maybe are not too relevant, the art market or something that are relevant.
That's
and
fine,
they're
but we're artists here, and this is an art space, and we're in a world in
the
which
money is relevant.
the market determines value largely, whether we like it or not.
Absolutely.
So, you know, I'm not an artist who sells a lot, but when I do, I'm happy because I can pay my bills and make something else.
And I need to pay the rent, and
But
in New York
also,
is super expensive.
that something has happened from between the 80s, which is when I started to work, and now, which is that around the late 90s, early aughts, the cities became so expensive that the nonprofit sector shrank to practically nothing.
Yeah.
And most nonprofits that have sustained themselves are sustaining themselves because they get corporate money. And before it was they got public money, right? So that has collapsed the difference between a downtown New York that was all alternative and not money oriented, and the art market. The art market is in every alternative space. It's in Cuchitrito's gallery, and it's in artist space, and there is no difference anymore. So in that process, what happened was, if you're an artist and you don't have a commercial gallery, you don't exist anymore, right? I didn't show in a commercial gallery until I was 41, because I didn't have to, because nobody was interested in video and performance anyway in commercial galleries. But now I live in a world in which if I don't have a gallery representation, basically I don't exist as an artist. For most curators working in museums, for most collectors, you know, that's what they're interested in. And even Ford and Mellon and all these super progressive foundations are playing the same game with the private sector.
But
So
then-
we can't ignore it.
But then
We
there is
can't
no
ignore it.
hope. You see that there is no hope. There is no hope for more than to be as powerful as the United States.
I mean, I'm not worried about being as powerful as the United
It's
States.
about the money because I believe that is a relevant thing there because it's true. The money is here, and you know.
No, but there are very wealthy people in Latin America. They just bank elsewhere because of the economic instability of those countries. You know, there are rich people all over. There are mega, you know, my God, Slim in Mexico, all these other super rich, the Jumex guys. There are super
Absolutely.
rich
I agree
people.
with you. In
But
Colombia, we
Joanna,
don't have
there is
so-
hope. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you
Yes.
so much.
Yes.
But I don't
There
think
is people
it's
working outside.
But ignoring the economic part
No,
of the
we
art
can do
market
that.
is not wise at all.
But
It's
I
not
believe that
practical.
we are not doing that. Maybe we want to address that in a different way. That you know that it has happening. But let's see. I say it's a tender moment yet. But let's see in a 5 or 10 years what is happening. What will happen there?
I mean, one thing that has happened here that hasn't happened in Latin America and that could make a difference is that there has been cultivation of certain sectors of the elites that finance the art world here to be more attuned to diversity and social engagement. So, for example, Aggie Guns, right, who's a multimillionaire, board member of MoMA Forever and Ever, funder of Studio in a School, you know, all that. What happened? She starts to sell some of her Rothkos and Liechtensteins and whatever else she has, and uses that money to do a project for formerly incarcerated people who are artists, right? Or, you know, Thelma Golden, who's really brilliant at negotiating these things, convinces all these super rich people to start buying African American art, and that has completely changed the situation of a lot of African American artists. Latin American collectors are still racist, elitist, white, nationalist assholes. Every single one of them.
Okay, and live
Every
in
single
Miami.
one of them. And they won't change. So I know people who promote black Brazilian art, they can't get white Brazilians to buy it. That art is sold everywhere else, but to the white people of their own country, okay? Because that elite is still very conservative, and they buy conservatively, and they play a very conservative role. For example, Patty Cisneros on the board of MoMA. She won't buy anything other than super high modern formalist artwork. So when MoMA reopened its building and they showed Latin American art, it was all the Cisneros collection stuff, right? So that's where change should happen and could happen, but none of the Latin American curators who work in museums are going to try. They're not trying.
No, they're not.
They're
But
not
the
trying.
people are trying to do it. But let's see. I believe that it's relevant. I'm sure that the system is working, as you're saying. I'm completely agree. I'm not, innocent in, to face that things. But I believe that some things are happening a different way. Not only in the art world, because people are tired about many things. And when I was a teenager, probably the future were more, I could be more sure about the future. I'm from Colombia. But now for the young people it's quite different. They have a completely different ideas and mind about the future. And that's completely different. But we need time because they're too young. Yeah, they're 20, 25. They're too young. But that's really important. Thank you so much for this passionate conversation. All of you, thank you so much. That's relevant. Juan and me, we used to have, topics like those, like, a Spanish guy living in New York for 24 years.
One thing that we left out is the most collectible art in New York City, which is called painting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When we go around, the first race going to Chelsea with Johanna was that she says very well made, and she writes for Art Nexus now, and I would go with her to see something, and once she had to write on a painter, and it's like she says very well done, but it's just fucking painting. After painting, after painting.
That's what sells.
And painting has been dead since I began art school in 1979 in Boston with Nan Golden, graduated and me starting. Painting and painting and painting. And the alternative, if you look at them, I get 1, 2, 3 shows, white columns, they are painters.
Yeah.
And then James Cohen and all these people go there and back them up because they want to discover the next fabulous painter. And the MFA things are still painted. Well, there's a diversity around that. And one nice thing I have to point at is that I went to Colombia to her curatorial 42 women of the Tertulian Museum, Mexico, and I've gone to Argentina, etc. There's less painting in places like us. Here in museums in Latin America, South America in particular, in Mexico, there's less painting and much more installation and much more socially imbued work that you can see and get engaged with. It's not just only about the marketable fucking painting again, right? Because everybody tells me I should do more painting, I could raise more money for white bucks, and I refuse to do that because I was a painter and I'm bored to death with painting, if it's only about painting.
I have to say, painting is like that Sicilian grandmother in Moonstruck that is always dying. If the grandmother is dying, he has to postpone the wedding and go back to Sicily. That's how I see painting. But that's a really interesting point, because I do want to say actually that I do have hope that there can be a change, but it is really hard to bring that change, especially within the Caribbean and Latin America, because of what Coco just said, and that's what I meant by us not being able to have a serious discourse within ourselves, because we're trapped in this history of colonization in which we have this race divide that we cannot seem to overcome, and until we can overcome them, it's really hard to set everything else aside and sort of value ourselves, right? And value the totality of everybody in the country. The country can be old or stable if you are only valuing 1/10 of the population. That doesn't make sense and will never make sense in that way. But I do feel that there are always moments in time where the system will override itself. just like any kind of, or there will be a glitch, and that glitch will force it to change. It will eventually, painting will come back again, but these moments do happen, they do happen, and whether if there is enough of a conversation and people are thinking about this critically enough, now within Latin America, I mean, when I was a young artist, and I can actually say that now, when I was a young artist, I mean, it is true, I would never imagine, I don't think there is any, well, that's maybe not true now, I can't say that now, but I would have never imagined that someone from Latin America would have bought my work, right? I honestly cannot say that now, I have collectors from Brazil who have purchased the work, so we have made progress. Is it significant progress? I don't know. But there is the possibility for a change, and I think it is in these moments and with these kinds of exhibitions and these kinds of conversations where that change can happen.
I agree with you, and I don't mean to sound like I have no hope. I just think that in general, Latin American curators and collectors and museums follow what they see that Americans and Europeans do, and they are very timid, so they move more slowly. So like the whole kind of new interest in Brazil in supporting black art, both in Brazil and abroad, this is a very new thing, has to do with the success of a handful of black Brazilians in the United States and at Documenta and at Venice, where they're like, oh, so this actually is desired by others, so now we will do this too. It's like Jorge Perez buying stuff about Latinas in Miami, Miami is like the biggest Latino city in America after Los Angeles, and it took until a couple of years ago for this to happen, because the collectors in Miami didn't want to buy anything from the Latino or African American community in Miami until somebody did it in New York or London or Dusseldorf or whatever. That's the pattern, is that they copy what happens elsewhere, including collecting patterns, right?
No, I agree. I agree with your previous statement too. They are racist. Yeah. No doubt about that.
But just also just
not a question. I wasn't questioning.
A classic Fanonian neo-colonial, that they value what the others think more than themselves. They value the European thing more than their own. They value whatever is said in Art Forum more than what is said in Art Nexus. And that doesn't go away. And that's still, even like I love Mexico City and I love the museums, but they are doing what we did 20 years ago. They're not inventing anything,
But that's part of being understanding that you've been colonized, and so you don't deal with that yourself. You don't know what the impact of that is, and you will still continue to import everything that you possibly can of value to the colony.
But it's also because their curators were educated here and in Europe. I can name every single one.
That point is great, because we return to the first point, about the colonial ideas and how those ideas, took over our bodies, our cultural production, and about everything. And I believe that this is the main idea on this exhibition. So this is a great conclusion, maybe. We walk around many issues, many topics that are on the context of this exhibition, and that's very powerful. Thank you so much. That's a great conversation. Thank you, Juana, Coco, Jacqueline, Jody, one white box, because in the house of this exhibition. Thank you. You had to be with us.
And the Department of Cultural Affairs.
And the people online.
Materials for the arts.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Juana.
Bye.
And with that, thank you very much
able to be a part of this
to everybody
conversation.
online.
We'll keep talking.